Today, we took the truck out of the shop, loaded her up on a trailer, took her down to a big parking lot with a really long entry road. We had a lot of fun. Some of the footage you're going to see is a little bit raw. I don't have, GoPros or a cameraman or a fancy computer. All I have is my phone. So please excuse, some of the raw footage, but I hope you enjoy, and we'll talk at the end. Well, it's test day. Came to a big parking lot, so I'm off the public roads since it's not tagged or titled. Well, it's titled. It's not tagged or insured or anything, so found a big old parking lot here at the church. It's got a really long, nice entrance road, and we're gonna drive this thing a little bit, see how it does. tires. I would have thought it'd been the rear, but I believe it's the front. Get you to do about a 15-point turn. Brakes were pretty good, actually. Sound like it's sliding the rears just a little bit. And by the way, the odometer is not calibrated, so we were not doing 70 miles an hour. I'm pretty happy with how it's doing so far. I was a little bit worried about steering, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But overall, she's doing really well. Transmission shifts. I do have a 2500 RPM stall converter to put in it, and that'll help that transmission out quite a bit in the idling situation, but I'm happy with it. She's doing really well for the maiden voyage. Finally got the truck out, got to drive it quite a bit rather than just up the street and back in first gear. Transmission shifts like it's supposed to, second gear, third gear. That makes me feel quite a bit better. I do have a 2500 RPM stall converter to put in the transmission. That will help considerably on the way the truck runs and idles. I've got the idle turned way up on it right now because when you put it in gear, it pulls the idle way down to 1,000 or below 1,000, and this cam is not happy below 1,000 RPMs at all. It just doesn't want to run that low. So in order for it to run, when I put it in gear, the idle's way up on the thing. Anyway, the torque converter will take care of that. Let's see. in the clips where I was loading and unloading the truck onto the trailer, you may have noticed that the tires on the first axle lifted off the ground. Well, that's because the airbags in the truck were maxed out. Front bags, rear bags, they were all about 100 psi, and that's for clearance reasons. You know, when you get to the top of the ramps and break over onto the trailer, don't want to drag anything underneath the truck. So 100 psi and all the airbags, so the truck is raised much higher than it typically would be. And you may have noticed when I unloaded the truck there in the parking lot, the front wheels look kind of funny. I mean, they look like, you know, they're just really cambered in, and just the geometry is just totally wrong. Again, that's because it was really jacked up in the air at that point. One thing that confuses me a little bit, I've never messed with a vehicle that had airbags in it before. This is my first. Never built one, never ridden in one, never messed with one. Air pressure in the front airbags. Sitting here in the garage and driving back and forth on, you know, around here in the neighborhood and back and forth on the driveway, I have settled on 30-40 psi in the rear airbags. The front airbags, to me, is the most important to get that little bit of a rake to make the truck look just right. For some reason, it wants 80 psi in the driver's side front and 60 psi in the passenger side front. Here in the garage and the driveway, that seems to be the perfect pressure. That's where I set the front end alignment. That gives me, you know, it's hard to show you without moving the camera, but you know, from inside of the fenders to the top of the tires, 2 inches, something like that. You know, looked like it was about right, about as low as you could get it reasonably, and still be able to drive it without things rubbing and scrubbing. Oddly enough, it's not consistent. Right now, the truck is sitting with 80, 60, just like it seemed like it wanted. The front end is two inches higher than it has been at the same air pressures. I don't really understand what's going on there, why that happens. You probably, or you may have noticed in much of the driving video, the front end of the truck is much higher than I want it to be. I want it to be just a little bit lower, kind of the point where I did the front end alignment. So I don't know exactly how to deal with that. I do have some front end work to do on the truck. I want to mess with the control arms. I would like to shorten the control arms about 1 inch. I'm very strongly considering just building new tubular control arms myself, 1 inch narrower. Steering geometry is not exactly right. You set the toe perfect at right height, or my intended right height, and when you drop the truck on down, it changes the toe quite a bit. So that tells me the steering rack that I have in this truck, it has a rack and pinion steering out of a mid-90s Camaro. I don't have the elevation of that rack exactly right to work with the suspension geometry, so I need to play with that just a little bit so that maybe the toe will be more correct through most of the travel. There was some squealing of the tires in the parking lot. You may have thought that was the rear tires, which would make sense. You know, a dual rear axle, it would make sense that when you turn, 2 of the tires are probably going to scrub a little bit. The squealing that you heard in the video sound like it's coming from the front tires, mostly the right front tire. Again, it comes to front end geometry. So oddly enough, as unique as this truck is, the front suspension seems to be giving me much more headache. The rear suspension seems to work perfectly. So far, I've not found any issues at all with the back of the truck. It all works exactly like I was hoping it would. I had some real concerns with the steering rack, the travel, the side-to-side travel of this Camaro steering rack. Messing around with it here in the garage during the wheel alignment, and the first time I took it up my street, I live on a dead-end street. There's a cul-de-sac at the end of the street. First time I went into that cul-de-sac, I had to make a 3-point turn. I could not turn this truck around in that cul-de-sac. Really got me worried about the steering angle, the steering travel. So I got to looking at it. As I said, there's the rack and pinion steering that's in this truck is out of a mid-90s Camaro. I measured the total side-to-side travel from lock to lock at about 4 3/8 of an inch. That's not a whole lot of travel. According to the internet, the original C10 steering geometry with the steering box and the drag link and the idler arm and all that stuff was somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 inches. So going from 7 inches, if that's true, down to 4 3/8, that's a really big difference. That's a lot of loss of steering. So I was looking into other options, what other steering racks I could go to that had more travel than this Camaro rack. So I was very pleased today. The truck drove really well. I was surprised how well it would turn and in the parking lot. To me, driving the truck, it was just fine. It drives like a long truck. This truck is 18 feet long. It's not going to turn like a Miata. But I was pleasantly surprised that it did not feel like the steering was short stroked, like I needed more steering angle. It actually felt about like I would expect when I had it all the way to lock in in a really tight turn. So I may not change the rack. I think I may play with the steering geometry a little bit as far as the height of the rack to try to get the toe to not change as much throughout the up and down travel of suspension. But so yeah, that was good. So there is more to do on the truck. I hope you stick with me and figure out how to work out some of the little nuances. Finish the paint, put the glass on the truck, finish the truck, and actually get it out and enjoy it, take to the road shows and things. For the first drive, well, the first real drive, at speed and pretty decent distance, I'm very pleased with how the truck has turned out so far. So stick around. We'll see what else we can get into. That's more like it. Get her on the ground where she looks better.